This is where global power really lives. I know it doesn't look like it. There are no flags here, no speeches, no cameras. Just water that shouldn't exist, and pipes that never stop flowing. For years, the world pretended places like this were someone else's problem. Too dirty, too toxic, too far away to matter. So someone else stepped in. Someone accepted the work no one wanted. The chemicals, the waste, the damage that would take decades to manage. While the rest of the world looked away, they stayed, learned it, perfected it. And slowly, quietly, everything began to depend on that choice. Until one day things didn't break. They just stopped arriving. A phone repair that took weeks. A car sitting unfinished in a factory lot, waiting for a part. A supply chain slowing down, with no clear explanation. No disaster, no headline, just quiet delays that spread. All of it traced back to one step the world refused to touch. A step buried in places like this. Cold, chemical, uninhabitable. The ones who kept this process, who kept the dirt everyone else rejected, ended up controlling what the world depends on. Not with weapons, not with threats, but with silence. But there is one step everything must pass through, and when that step slows, everything else does too. The next global crisis won't look like a war. It will feel like a story that starts quietly, right here. This story doesn't end here. Subscribe. Your support helps keep this channel independent, focused, and analytical. When the world looked away, 1980-2010, what happened next wasn't accidental. It was documented, dated, and at the time widely praised. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, the United States, Europe, and Japan were tightening environmental regulations. Chemical-intensive industries became expensive to maintain. Rare earth processing was among the worst. The process required hundreds of chemical separation steps, strong acids, large volumes of toxic waste, and residues containing radioactive elements like thorium. In California, the Mountain Pass mine, once the world's leading rare earth producer, became a political and environmental liability. By the late 1990s, stricter regulations and rising costs made large-scale processing increasingly unattractive. At the same time, something else was happening. In China, the government made a deliberate choice. In 1992, Deng Xiaoping famously said, "The Middle East has oil. China has rare earths." That wasn't a slogan. It was a strategy. Throughout the 1990s, China invested heavily in rare earth separation and refining. Not just mining, processing. Universities expanded chemical engineering programs. State-owned firms absorbed environmental costs others refused to carry. By the early 2000s, the results were visible. China was producing rare earth materials at prices Western companies could not match, not because it was more efficient at first, but because it accepted costs others avoided. Environmental damage, long-term waste storage, years of experimentation. While Western firms closed facilities, Chinese plants stayed open. They learned. By 2005, China controlled roughly 80–90% of global rare earth processing capacity, not because it owned all the mines, but because it had become the only place where raw material could be reliably turned into usable components. The rest of the world noticed, briefly. In 2010, during a diplomatic dispute with Japan over the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, China quietly restricted rare earth exports. No official embargo, no announcement. Shipments slowed, prices spiked. Japan, whose automotive and electronics industries depended heavily on these materials, felt the impact almost immediately. That moment should have been a wake-up call. It wasn't. Instead, global supply chains doubled down on efficiency. Companies optimized for cost. Governments assumed markets would adjust. Redundancy was treated as waste. Mines reopened in places like Australia and the United States, but processing capacity did not follow. The Mountain Pass mine restarted operations in the 2010s, yet much of its output still had to be shipped abroad for separation. The knowledge gap had become too wide. Chemical engineers trained in large-scale rare earth separation were scarce outside China. Waste handling infrastructure had been dismantled. Local opposition made rebuilding politically toxic. What remained was a paradox. Rare earths existed in many countries, the United States, Australia, Brazil, India, Vietnam, but the ability to transform them into magnets, alloys, and precision components did not. That ability had consolidated. This is where the story turns uncomfortable. The world didn't lose access to resources, it lost access to capability. And capability, once concentrated, behaves like power. By the late 2010s, advanced technologies, electric vehicles, wind turbines, missile guidance systems, satellites, all shared a quiet dependency. They passed through the same bottleneck, the same chemical step, the same industrial environments, the same places the world once refused to touch. Looking back, the pattern is clear. Environmental pressure in the West, strategic patience in China, market logic replacing long-term resilience. No villain, no single decision. Just 3 decades of choices that all pointed in the same direction. And by the time the dependency became obvious, the system had already hardened. The step everything must pass through. The bottleneck isn't hidden underground, it sits in plain sight. Inside chemical plants, inside refineries, inside places the modern world prefers not to show. What most people call rare earths arrive mixed together. 17 elements, indistinguishable at first glance, useless in that form. What matters is what happens next, the separation. Each element must be isolated individually, not mechanically, chemically. That means repeated cycles of crushing, dissolving, extracting, and re-extracting. Hundreds of stages, each one slightly different. Each one sensitive to temperature, acidity, and contamination. There is no shortcut. If one step fails, the entire batch is ruined. This is where scale becomes decisive. In theory, any advanced economy could do this. In practice, very few ever did. The chemistry is unforgiving, the waste is persistent, and the margins are thin unless you do it at massive scale. Western companies tried. Most failed. By the 1990s, rare earth separation outside China had become commercially irrational. Costs were too high, regulations too strict, public resistance too strong. So capacity disappeared. And once it disappeared, so did the learning curve. China went the opposite direction. Instead of optimizing for short-term profit, it optimized for mastery. Processing plants were built near mines, then expanded. Waste was stored, not solved. Losses were absorbed by the state. Engineers were trained to do one thing well: separate materials no one else wanted to touch. Over time, yields improved, purity increased, costs dropped. What began as a liability slowly became leverage. By the mid-2000s, the structure was locked in. Raw material from Australia, from the United States, from Africa, all flowing toward the same destination. Not because of coercion, because there was nowhere else to go. By 2015, China controlled roughly 90% of global rare earth separation and refining. Not mining, not reserves, the step that turns material into capability. This is where substitution fails. You can't simply replace neodymium in high-performance magnets without sacrificing efficiency. You can't swap dysprosium in military systems without redesigning the entire platform. Alternatives exist on paper, not at scale, not quickly. Which means control doesn't need to be absolute. It just needs to be early. When access tightens, industries don't collapse immediately. They hesitate. Production slows. Inventories shrink. Costs rise quietly. Companies wait. Governments negotiate. Time does the rest. That's why this step rarely appears in political speeches. It doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't make noise. But it shapes outcomes long before decisions become visible. The world once believed this process was interchangeable, that markets would adjust. That capacity could be rebuilt if needed. That assumption no longer holds, because rebuilding this step isn't about money alone. It's about time, experience, tolerance for damage, and those are not evenly distributed. What looks like industrial infrastructure is actually a strategic filter. Everything passes through it. Nothing bypasses it. And the longer that remains true, the less relevant minds, reserves, and rhetoric become. By the time governments began talking seriously about reshoring and diversification, they were already negotiating from a position of dependence. The question was no longer who has the resources. It was who controls the step that decides whether those resources matter at all. When control becomes a weapon. By the time governments realized how concentrated the system had become, the numbers were already lopsided. By 2010, China was responsible for roughly 97% of global rare earth oxide production, 90% plus of separation and refining. Nearly all high-performance rare earth magnet manufacturing. This wasn't dominance. It was near-total dependency, and it had consequences. The first real stress test came that same year. In September 2010, a Chinese fishing trawler collided with Japanese Coast Guard vessels near the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands. The political dispute escalated quickly. No sanctions were announced. No embargo was declared. But rare earth shipments to Japan slowed almost overnight. Customs inspections intensified. Export licenses were delayed. Containers stopped moving. Within weeks, prices spiked. Neodymium oxide prices jumped more than 300%. Dysprosium prices rose even faster. Japanese manufacturers reported immediate shortages. Toyota, Hitachi, and other major firms scrambled to secure inventory. The message was clear, even without being spoken. Japan responded aggressively. Between 2010 and 2015, Tokyo invested billions in diversification, stockpiling rare earths, funding recycling programs, supporting Australian producer Lynas. It helped, but it didn't break the bottleneck. Because Lynas could mine and partially process materials, yet full-scale separation and magnet production remained constrained. The choke point held. The United States took longer to react. The Mountain Pass mine reopened in 2012, backed by private capital, but the effort struggled. Processing costs were high, waste disposal was politically sensitive, and global prices, controlled by Chinese output, undercut profitability. By 2015, the company filed for bankruptcy, not because demand was low, but because control over pricing and processing remained elsewhere. This is where the system reveals its asymmetry. China doesn't need to cut off supply entirely. It only needs to adjust volumes. A 5 to 10% reduction is often enough to push prices up, create uncertainty, delay production timelines. Industries that rely on just-in-time logistics feel it first. Automotive manufacturing, defense contractors, renewable energy projects. None of them can pivot quickly. By the late 2010s, this vulnerability had become explicit in military planning. A single F-35 fighter jet requires hundreds of kilograms of rare earth materials across its systems, radar actuators, electronic warfare components. The same is true for precision-guided munitions, satellite control systems, advanced naval sensors. None of these systems tolerate substitution well. Performance drops. Reliability suffers. Certification timelines explode. That's why rare earths began appearing quietly in national security documents. The US Department of Defense formally classified them as critical materials. The European Union added them to its Critical Raw Materials Act. Supply chain resilience became a strategic objective, but objectives don't create factories. By 2020, China's share of mining had declined somewhat, to around 60%. That number confused many observers. They thought dependence was easing. It wasn't. Because mining was never the point. Processing still flowed through the same bottleneck. And magnet manufacturing, the final most valuable step, remained overwhelmingly concentrated. This is where leverage becomes structural. Even if alternative mines exist, even if recycling improves, even if new projects come online, the time required to replicate decades of chemical mastery is measured in years, not quarters. And during that time, the existing controller sets the pace. That's why this form of power rarely looks aggressive. It doesn't need to escalate. It only needs to wait while others scramble to rebuild what they dismantled. What started as an environmental outsourcing decision has become a strategic asymmetry baked into the global system. And unlike tariffs or treaties, it can't be reversed with a signature. By the time the world began talking seriously about decoupling, it was already negotiating with a system that had no immediate substitute. And the longer that reality holds, the more this quiet control shapes outcomes long before any crisis becomes visible. Why the clean energy future isn't clean at all. To understand what comes next, forget chemistry for a moment. Think in terms of motion. Anything that moves, spins, or reacts precisely to electricity needs control. And modern control depends on magnets, not ordinary magnets, not fridge magnets, but high-performance magnets that don't lose strength under heat, pressure, or vibration. Those magnets are built using rare earth elements. Take an electric car. Inside its motor, magnets control how efficiently electricity turns into movement. Without rare earth magnets, the motor becomes heavier, less efficient, less powerful, which means shorter range, higher costs, more energy wasted as heat. That's why most high-performance electric vehicles use them. Not because companies prefer them, but because alternatives don't scale well. Now multiply that. A single offshore wind turbine can contain hundreds of kilograms of rare earth magnets, not to generate power, but to control it. The turbine blades spin slowly. The generator must still produce stable electricity. That stability depends on magnetic precision. Without it, the grid becomes unreliable. This is where the paradox appears. The technologies marketed as clean are often more dependent on rare earths than the systems they replace. Electric vehicles, wind power, advanced batteries, smart grids. Each step toward electrification increases dependence on these materials. Now here's the part most people miss. Demand doesn't rise gradually, it compounds. As countries commit to climate targets, they don't just replace old systems, they scale new ones. By 2030, global demand for rare earth magnets is expected to more than double. By 2040, it could triple. That growth doesn't come from consumer electronics. It comes from energy infrastructure. Once installed, these systems can't easily switch materials. They are locked in. So what happens if supply tightens? Not a blackout, not immediately. Projects slow, costs rise, timelines slip. A wind farm takes longer to complete. An electric vehicle rollout misses targets. Governments quietly revise projections. The transition doesn't stop. It stalls. This is why control matters more than volume. You don't need to cut supply in half to shape outcomes. Small delays, small shortages, small price increases. Over time, they redirect entire strategies. For countries trying to meet climate goals, this creates a dilemma. Build fast and depend on the bottleneck, or build slow and fall behind. Neither option feels good. Hand rebuilding the missing step locally isn't just expensive, it's politically uncomfortable. It means reopening debates that were supposedly settled decades ago. Waste, pollution, long-term damage. The same issues that caused the world to look away in the first place. That's why the control point holds. Not because alternatives don't exist on paper, but because real systems don't change easily. They inherit their dependencies. At this point, the world isn't choosing between dependence and independence. It's choosing between managed dependence and delayed disruption. And most governments quietly pick the first. This is why the future everyone is racing toward still runs through the same narrow channel. A channel built decades ago, out of decisions most people never noticed. And once infrastructure locks in, it rarely unlocks itself. Why rebuilding control takes a decade? Once the dependency became undeniable, governments didn't stay still. They reacted, not dramatically, but deliberately. In the United States, rare earths were officially labeled critical to national security. In Europe, they were added to lists of strategic raw materials. Funding followed. Announcements followed, timelines followed, reality followed last. Rebuilding this missing step isn't like reopening a factory. It requires three things that don't scale quickly: time, tolerance, experience. Money helps, but it's not the bottleneck. Take processing plants. A single large-scale separation facility can take 7 to 10 years from planning to operation, not because of construction, but because of permitting, waste handling, and community resistance. The chemistry doesn't disappear when the plant shuts down at night. Waste must be stored, monitored, contained for decades. That reality alone delays projects by years. Then there's the knowledge gap. Chemical separation at scale is not something engineers pick up quickly. China didn't build mastery in 5 years. It took 3 decades of iteration, failed batches, contaminated outputs, equipment corrosion, waste accidents. Every failure taught the system something. That learning curve is now embedded in existing plants. Starting over means repeating much of it. This is why timelines keep slipping. The United States announced plans to rebuild domestic processing capacity multiple times in the 2010s. Most projects stalled or downsized. Europe faces similar barriers: strong environmental protections, fragmented political authority, public opposition. Even when funding exists, execution drags. Australia presents the most successful alternative so far. Companies like Lynas built mining and partial processing capacity outside China, but even there, the final steps, high-purity separation and magnet manufacturing, remain limited. The bottleneck narrows, but it doesn't disappear. This creates a strategic mismatch. Demand is rising faster than replacement capacity. Governments announce independence targets for 2030 or 2035. But facilities planned today may not reach full output until the late 2030s, and that assumes no delays. Meanwhile, existing infrastructure keeps running. Supply chains don't pause to wait for resilience. They optimize around what works now, and what works now still passes through the same control point. This is why dependency persists even when everyone agrees it's a problem. The cost of change is immediate. The benefit is distant. Political systems struggle with that trade-off. Industries hedge instead. They stockpile. They diversify marginally. They redesign at the edges, but the core remains. There's also a limit to how much substitution can help. Some rare earth applications tolerate alternatives, others don't. Military systems, aerospace components, precision motors. These systems are certified for specific materials. Changing them isn't a software update, it's a redesign that takes years. By the time those redesigns are complete, the strategic environment may already have shifted. That's the quiet leverage of control. It doesn't force decisions, it constrains them. This is why the system doesn't collapse under pressure. It adapts, slowly, and slow adaptation favors whoever already controls the center. At this stage, no major economy is fully independent. They are all managing exposure, negotiating timelines, balancing speed against risk, and hoping no major disruption tests the system too hard before alternatives mature. Because if that test comes too early, the question won't be who planned best. It will be who already had control when the system tightened. What happens when the system tightens? The system doesn't fail all at once. It tightens. A license takes longer to approve. A shipment waits an extra inspection cycle. Priority quietly shifts to domestic buyers. Nothing illegal, nothing dramatic, just friction. Imagine a regional crisis. Not global war, not yet. Just enough uncertainty to make governments nervous. Insurance premiums rise. Shipping schedules slip. Companies begin asking the same question at the same time. How exposed are we? That's when pressure moves upstream. Export volumes don't stop. They adjust 5% less, 10% delayed. For industries built on precision timing, that's enough. An electric vehicle factory doesn't shut down immediately. It slows. Production targets are revised. Launch dates pushed back. Costs quietly absorbed. Investors notice. Governments explain. No panic. Just erosion. Defense systems respond even more cautiously. Stockpiles are checked. Procurement timelines extended. Training schedules adjusted. No announcement is made, but planners now assume scarcity. And once that assumption enters planning, it shapes every decision that follows. This is the real effect of control, not denial, not confrontation, but constraint. Now zoom out. Multiple countries feel this pressure simultaneously. Not enough to coordinate, not enough to confront. Each responds alone, stockpiling more, paying higher prices, accepting delays. Competition replaces cooperation, and the bottleneck tightens further. This is how local leverage becomes global. No single decision triggers it. It emerges from overlap, from shared dependence, from systems designed for efficiency, not resilience. At that point, alternatives don't disappear. They just arrive too late. New facilities are announced, pilot plants open, research funding expands. But infrastructure doesn't rush, chemistry doesn't compress, waste doesn't vanish. Years pass, and during those years, control remains where it already is. This is why power today looks different from the past. It doesn't conquer territory, it shapes timelines. It decides what can happen now and what must wait. The world once believed this system could be rebuilt on demand. That belief no longer holds, not because it's impossible, but because time is no longer neutral. Every year of delay strengthens whoever already controls the center. Every crisis that arrives early magnifies that advantage, and that's the quiet truth behind this entire story. The most important power in the modern world doesn't announce itself. It doesn't threaten, it doesn't argue. It simply exists where everything must pass. The control point. This place was never meant to matter. It was meant to be hidden, ignored, left behind. For decades, the world treated it as a problem to outsource, something too dirty to touch. But systems remember. They remember who stayed, who learned, who accepted the cost everyone else refused. And over time, that choice turned into leverage. The next global crisis won't begin with chaos. It will begin with delay, with explanations, with revisions, with quiet adjustments no one announces. And by the time the consequences become visible, the decision will already have been made. Not on a battlefield, not in a capital, but in places like this. Because in the modern world, power doesn't belong to whoever owns the resources. It belongs to whoever controls the step no one else can skip. And that control point is already built.